Can you cook? The question crossed the cold morning air before the wagon had even rolled to a full stop. Hadley Crow didn't lift her head. She remained kneeling beside the broken axle of the abandoned freight cart at the edge of Pine Hollow Road, her chapped fingers working a length of frayed rope into a careful knot. The rider waited. "I'm speaking to you, ma'am." "Depends on what a man calls cooking," Hadley answered without turning, her voice low and steady against the wind. "I call it feeding 12 men through a storm that wants to bury them, keeping a stove that pulls, and knowing what a sack of flour weighs before it weighs nothing at all." Only then did Hadley slowly rise to her feet. Her knees ached from the cold ground. She pressed one hand against the side of the cart for balance, and her wedding band, worn thin as a wire, caught the gray light for half a second before disappearing again beneath her glove. She turned to face the man on horseback. He sat motionless in the saddle, a tall figure carved from weather and silence. Wade Holloway, owner of the Black Pine Ranch. His pale eyes moved over her patched wool shawl, over the dark mourning dress that had been mended at the elbows so many times the stitches had become part of the cloth. They lingered for a moment on the small wooden box strapped to her back. It was nearly everything Hadley Crow still owned in this world. Her late husband's compass, a tin canister of dried sage, 3 handwritten cookery books bound in oilcloth, and a small ledger filled with columns no preacher had ever blessed. Everything else had been carried off by creditors after Thomas had been thrown from a green horse and broken his neck 6 weeks earlier. The cabin, the 2 milk goats, the press where she had once made cheese for the railroad camps, all gone before the ground had even settled over his grave. But Wade Holloway did not reach into his coat for a coin. He did not ask whether she had family waiting for her down the line. He did not offer pity, and Hadley would have refused it if he had. Pity was a meal that left a person hungrier than before. Wade studied her for another long moment, the kind of moment that on the frontier could mean a deal or a dismissal. Well, Hadley straightened her shoulders. In that single movement she shed every trace of the grieving widow stranded beside a broken wagon. "If there is flour, water, and a stove that draws clean," she said evenly, "I can cook." A long beat of silence passed between them. It was not approval, it was a measuring. Wade Holloway nudged his horse forward. "Climb up, then." "I'll walk," Hadley replied, tightening the leather strap of the wooden box. "You've walked far enough already, ma'am." "I have my feet under me yet," she said. "Just point me the direction." The ranch revealed itself long before its troubles did. Black Pine Ranch sat in a wide bowl of land between 2 ridges, 14 miles from the nearest town of Pine Hollow. From the wagon road, it looked the way a frontier ranch was meant to look. The main house stood square against the prairie wind. A long bunkhouse leaned only slightly with age. Corral fences stretched in clean lines across the autumn grass. A smokehouse, blackened by decades of careful use, still kept its post at the edge of the yard. Beyond it, a narrow creek carried the first thin glass of morning ice along its banks. Nothing about the place suggested anything was wrong. Only when Hadley stepped through the kitchen door did the picture fall apart. Smoke clung to the rafters instead of climbing through the chimney. The stove wore a heavy collar of soot. Ash had risen too high beneath the grate. A flour barrel rested against an outside wall where damp had already crept into the bottom staves. Salt beef hung too close to lingering warmth. The coffee pot held a stubborn black crust that promised bitterness in every cup. This was not a careless kitchen. It was a kitchen that had simply forgotten how to be cared for, and Hadley Crow, widow and stranger, had just walked into it. Wade Holloway watched her eyes travel from one corner of the kitchen to another. He saw nothing unusual. She saw a dozen quiet failures, each one feeding the next like a slow leak in a roof nobody had thought to climb up and check. Hadley lowered her wooden box onto the long pine table. She did not sigh. She did not press a hand to her face the way another woman might have. She simply turned in a slow circle, taking the measure of the room the way a wheelwright might study a wagon that everyone else had given up for scrap. It wasn't ruined. It had only stopped being understood. Wade expected her first question to be about supper, about how many mouths to feed, about what kind of meat hung in the smokehouse. Instead, Hadley looked at the iron stove and asked, Do you have a length of clean linen, the kind a body might tear into strips? Wade frowned slightly. Mrs. Holloway kept rags in the cedar chest. He paused before saying her name fully. My late wife. Then I'll need 3 of them, Hadley said quietly, and a bucket of cold ash water if anyone here knows how to make it. Otherwise, lye soap will do. Wade nodded once. He did not ask why. She walked straight to the stove. With slow, deliberate hands, she drew out the heavy ash from beneath the grate until only a thin gray bed remained, just enough for fresh coals to breathe through. She opened the damper. She held a narrow strip of linen near the firebox door and watched it carefully. The cloth barely trembled, then it fluttered, then it sagged again as though the draft itself had grown tired of trying. The fire is not what's failing you, Hadley said softly, almost to herself. The smoke has no road to travel. A rough laugh sounded from the doorway. Silas Penn, the old camp cook who had managed the Black Pine kitchen for nearly 15 winters, stood leaning against the frame. His arms were folded across a stained apron. We don't need a widow woman waving handkerchiefs at the stove, he said, his voice rough with tobacco and habit. The boys need beef, and they need it hot. Hadley never lifted her eyes to him. She kept her attention on the strip of linen as it stirred weakly in the uneven draft. On the frontier, silence sometimes questioned a man's habits far more sharply than any argument ever could. The pantry held more than Hadley had expected to find. 42 pounds of flour in 2 sacks, one of them already turning at the seams. A side of salt beef hanging from a hook gone rusty. 3 sacks of pinto beans stacked directly on the cold board floor. A small barrel of cornmeal. 2 dozen onions, half of them softening at the root. A jar of molasses that had crystallized along the inside of the glass. She began with the beans. She put them to soak in the largest kettle she could find. The smell of salt beef and water and rendered fat slowly filled the kitchen, pushing the old smell of smoke and ash into the corners where it belonged. Then came the biscuits. The first pan failed. The tops browned in less than 4 minutes while the centers remained pale and damp. Silas laughed loud enough for the men in the yard to hear him. Hadley did not throw the biscuits away. She broke one open, studied the inside, and quietly took her small ledger from the wooden box. She wrote a single line, fire too hot at the door, dead heat at the back of the firebox. Then she banked the coals differently. She fed only smaller pieces of split pine, no thicker than her wrist. She waited until the iron of the stove top no longer hissed when she touched it with a wet fingertip. The second pan came out golden across the top, soft and steaming in the middle, with that faint sweet smell that good biscuits always carried when the heat and the dough had finally come to an understanding. Wade walked in just as she was lifting them from the pan. He took one without speaking. He ate it slowly. Then he reached for a second one and set it carefully on a tin plate. That one, he said, his voice low, is for the widow. That was the only proof Hadley needed that the man understood more than he was willing to say. By the following afternoon, all 16 ranch hands had ridden back in from the high pasture for the autumn gather. They came in stiff from 3 nights of sleeping on cold ground, their coats stained with creek mud and cattle dust. They expected the same supper they had eaten for as long as any of them could remember at Black Pine. Burnt coffee strong enough to peel a horseshoe. Salt beef boiled until it surrendered all flavor. Hard biscuits a man had to soak before he dared bite. Instead, Hadley Crow set out a long table of food they did not recognize at first. A deep iron kettle of bean and salt beef stew, thick enough to coat a spoon but loose enough to pour easily over warm biscuits. A heavy skillet of corn bread baked golden at the edges, cut into squares the size of a man's palm. A pot of fresh coffee made from beans she had ground that morning and brewed only once, never boiled. A small bowl of molasses thinned with hot water and a pinch of salt, set out for any man who wanted to drizzle it over his bread the way mothers did back east. She did not hurry. She did not make a show of the work. She served the bowls in steady order, oldest hands first, youngest last, and she kept the coffee pot hot on a trivet at the back of the stove without ever letting it come to a true boil. Before anyone in the room noticed what she was doing, Hadley had also placed 3 small wooden buckets in a row beside the back door, potato peelings in one, bread ends and biscuit crumbs in another, sour milk and bacon drippings in the third. Jasper Doone, the ranch's lead hand, watched her without saying a word. He was a tall, lean man of 40 with a gray streak through his beard that he had earned during a stampede in '83. Across the room, an older cowhand named Wiley Tate sat with his bowl held close to his chest, his weathered face turned slightly toward the kitchen door. Wiley had ridden through more bad winters than any other man at Black Pine, and he had buried 2 partners during the great die-up of '86 and '87. He chewed slowly. He swallowed. He nodded almost to himself before he murmured, "That woman ain't cooking, boys. She's counting days." No one answered him. The room grew strangely quiet. Spoons scraped the bottoms of bowls and then scraped again. 2 of the younger hands went back for second servings without being invited. Later that evening, after the lamps had been trimmed low and the bunkhouse door had closed for the night, one of the youngest hands, a boy of 19 named Caleb Furrow, stopped on the threshold of the kitchen, wiped the dried mud from his boots against the iron scraper, and only then stepped inside to set down his empty tin cup. No one had told him to do that. The kitchen itself had already told him. The morning after the men returned, Hadley carried her small ledger into the pantry instead of the kitchen. She worked in silence by the light of a single oil lamp. The flour barrels leaned against an outside wall where the damp had already crept into the lower staves. The bean sacks rested directly on the cold board floor. A barrel of potatoes sat in the wettest, coldest corner of the root cellar, while onions buried beneath the top layer had already begun to soften and weep at the root. She changed nothing until she had seen everything. Then she divided the pantry into 3 simple zones, exactly the way her mother had taught her 30 years ago in a stone cellar in eastern Pennsylvania. A dry upper shelf for flour, cornmeal, and salt. A cool lower corner for potatoes, turnips, and onions, each kind kept apart so one would not spoil the other. A hanging rack near the small window where salt beef and bundled herbs could rest in air that moved instead of air that sat still and turned sour around them. Using scraps of cottonwood plank she found behind the smokehouse, Hadley raised every flour barrel and bean sack a full 7 inches above the floorboards. Silas watched her with growing impatience. "Those sacks have sat there 10 years, he grumbled, "and they'll sit there 10 more. Hadley reached into the nearest sack without answering him. She pulled out a handful of flour and let it sift slowly between her fingers. The grains nearest the bottom of the sack came out in small, damp clumps that did not break apart in the air the way good dry flour should. She held her open palm toward the lamp so Silas could see for himself. "It only takes 1 wet corner," she said quietly. "The rest will follow." For the first time since Hadley had walked into the kitchen at Black Pine, Silas Penn had nothing ready to say back. He shifted his weight, opened his mouth once, then closed it again. He turned and walked out of the pantry without another word. The matter was not settled between them, but something had been set down on the floor that he could not laugh his way around. Hadley opened her ledger and began to write. Pounds of flour on hand. Pounds usable. Pounds at risk. Sacks of beans. Pounds of salt beef. Days of coffee at current pace. Days of coffee at storm pace. Mouths to feed. Probable days of isolation if heavy snow closed the wagon road to Pine Hollow. Wade Holloway glanced down at the page over her shoulder. Until that moment, he had quietly assumed the little ledger held recipes copied from her mother's hand or perhaps verses from a family Bible. Now he saw columns of figures. They were not measuring meals. They were measuring how long Black Pine Ranch could stay alive if the world outside its gate decided to close in. Hadley noticed the heifers before anyone at the ranch thought to mention them to her. 11 young animals stood in the lower pen near the creek. None of them were starving. None of them looked ready for January either. Their hips showed through dull winter coats. They lingered too long over each mouthful of hay, the way an old man lingers over a meal he cannot quite taste anymore. Wade rested his forearms on the corral fence beside her. "I'm thinking about selling them," he said, his eyes on the lower pasture. We're short close to 20 tons of hay if winter comes early and the buyer up from Cheyenne is making an offer this week. He drew a folded letter from inside his coat. The offer printed on it was low. It was meant to be low. Wade knew it. The buyer knew it. The buyer was counting on Winter doing the rest of the negotiating. Hadley did not argue. She did not lift her chin and tell him he was wrong. Instead, she went back to the kitchen and filled a clean wooden bucket with bread ends, wheat bran from the bottom of an old sack, sour milk from the morning skimming, warm water from the stove kettle, and a small pinch of salt. She carried the bucket down to the lower pen herself. The first mash was too thin. Two of the heifers sniffed at it and walked away. A third lipped at the surface and then turned its head. Hadley flipped back through her ledger to adjust the mixture. Less water, more bran. Smaller portions offered twice a day instead of one large feeding. She tried again the following morning, then again the morning after that. By the third feeding, all 11 animals had their heads down at the trough. The weakest of them, a small red heifer with a torn ear that the men had already half written off, was the last to step forward. Hadley waited without moving. She did not coax. She did not whistle. She simply stood with her hands folded inside her shawl while the wind moved across the open ground behind her. At last, the small red heifer lowered her head and began to eat. No one cheered. No one called out across the yard. The wind still carried the same iron chill across the lower pen as it had the day before, but something had changed. Not enough for anyone outside Black Pine to notice, enough for Winter to remember. By the last week of October, Pine Hollow Basin no longer looked the way it had in early autumn. A thin crust of frost clung to the iron pump handle every morning before sunrise. The mornings arrived quieter, the kind of quiet that settles into a valley only when the geese have already passed overhead. The blue cattle dog at Black Pine, a half-blind old heeler named Brindle, had begun curling himself against the warm bricks behind the kitchen stove whenever the wind shifted out of the northeast. The cattle noticed it too. They drifted toward the lower ground hours earlier than they had only a week before, gathering near the willow break where the wind could not reach them. Even the crows had begun flying lower across the pasture, their black wings beating closer to the bent grass. The chimney spoke its own warning. Instead of climbing straight up into the open sky, the smoke flattened against the wind and slid sideways across the cedar shingles of the kitchen roof. Hadley took her pencil from the small tin cup on the windowsill and wrote a single line in the ledger. October 29th. Wind shifted northeast, pressure falling. That afternoon, a neighboring rancher named Ezra Goff stopped by the yard on his way back from Pine Hollow. He was a heavy-set man of 50 with a habit of laughing at things before he understood them. He saw Hadley standing at the corner of the pantry, counting flour, leftover scraps, hay bales, and days. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his rein. "Winter comes cold every year, ma'am," he said, leaning down from his saddle with a wide grin. "Men get through it the same way men always have. More beef, more firewood, more whiskey, and a loaded rifle by the door." Across the yard, old Wiley Tate heard every word. He kept mending a leather harness without looking up. He did not defend Hadley. He did not argue with Ezra. Old men who had survived enough winters knew something younger men too often forgot. Nature never joined the loudest conversation in the room. Hadley did not answer either. Her eyes stayed fixed on the smoke sliding sideways across the kitchen roof. Ezra Goff's laughter was not the sound she was listening to. She was listening to the wind. 3 nights later, the wind changed without warning. The chimney answered first. A heavy wave of smoke rolled backward through the firebox and pushed out around the iron door. Then another wave followed. Within seconds, the kitchen filled with a bitter gray haze that stung the eyes and burned the back of every throat in the room. The ranch hands at the long table began coughing into their sleeves. Wade pulled the back door open, and freezing prairie air rushed in across the floor. Sela's pen pointed at the stove with a thick finger. "I told you," he snapped, his voice rough with smoke and old satisfaction. "This old iron's finished. You cleaned out too much ash and you've ruined the bed of it." Hadley did not answer him. She reached again for the same length of clean linen and held it at the firebox opening. The cloth fluttered, stopped, then pushed backward against her hand. She stepped outside without arguing. The cold struck her face like a flat palm. Her eyes traveled from the chimney cap to the tree line where the northeast wind hit the roof and spilled down across the flue. When she came back inside, she spoke calmly, the way a doctor speaks when he has already seen the patient breathe again. "The stove is not failing," she said. "The wind is forcing cold air down the chimney because the firebox door is staying open too long between feedings. The smoke cools before it has the chance to rise." She picked up smaller pieces of split pine from the wood box, none thicker than a child's wrist. "Feed the fire a little at a time," she said. "Close the door between every piece." She folded a sheet of old newspaper into a long taper, lit it from the lamp, and held the small flame up inside the flue for a slow count of 10. "We warm the chimney first," she said, "then the draft will carry the smoke up where it belongs." The next fire was built exactly that way. Small wood. Door closed quickly. Flue preheated before any heavier fuel was added. Every man in the room watched her do it. The smoke hesitated for one long heartbeat at the mouth of the firebox. Then it turned upward. It climbed cleanly through the chimney and disappeared into the darkening November sky. The kitchen fell silent. Sela's pen offered no apology. But for the first time since Hadley Crowe had walked through the door of Black Pine Ranch, he did not laugh either. November settled quietly over Pine Hollow Basin. Nothing changed all at once. That was exactly why most folks failed to notice it changing at all. The coffee no longer carried the bitter taste of grounds left to scorch through a second boiling. Biscuits and corn bread disappeared from the table at supper instead of hardening on a shelf overnight. Every kettle of stew came out filling without being wasteful. Hadley measured enough for hungry men, but very little of it ever found its way into the 3 buckets by the back door. The kitchen had found its rhythm. Soon, the ranch began finding one of its own. During the late autumn work of bringing the last of the herd down from the high benches, Jasper Doone noticed there were fewer arguments in the bunkhouse after supper. More men came in for breakfast before the first gray light reached the corral. Small mistakes around the cattle happened less often because tired men were no longer trying to do hard work on hollow stomachs. The change reached beyond the kitchen, too. Without being asked, Wade Holloway repaired the loose latch on the root cellar door before another cold front pushed down out of the mountains. A new pine shelf appeared along one pantry wall, sanded smooth and set perfectly level. Every evening, a neat stack of wrist-sized kindling waited beside the stove. Each piece was split to the same careful size Hadley preferred. Neither of them mentioned any of it. When Wade came in late from riding the south fence one bitter evening, a covered tin plate still waited beside the warm stove. The stew underneath was hot. The coffee in the pot was fresh, not reheated twice. Nothing had been forgotten. Later that same night, Hadley noticed the carefully stacked kindling beside the hearth. She looked toward the dark woodshed. Wade was already walking back toward the barn with a lantern swinging at his side. She said nothing. The next morning, his slice of dried apple pie was just a little larger than everyone else's. No words passed between them. Trust on the frontier rarely arrived as a conversation. More often, it arrived as work that no longer needed to be asked for. The first week of November brought a different kind of visitor to Black Pine Ranch. A covered buggy rolled into the yard just after noon, its wheels carrying more polished paint than honest mud. The man who stepped down wore a dark wool coat so clean it looked untouched by any kind of ranch work. Mortimer Pell had come from the Cheyenne Stockmen's Credit Association. He climbed the porch steps without removing his gloves. He entered the dining room without removing his hat until Wade made a quiet gesture toward the rack by the door. The ranch hands had only just finished their noon meal. Their bowls were still on the long table when Mortimer Pell spread a thick stack of papers across the scarred wood as if he were already claiming it. "The spring credit balance," he said evenly, his eyes moving across the figures, "still stands at $640. He tapped another page with one neat fingernail. "And winter cattle prices in Cheyenne are already slipping below where they sat at the same time last year." Wade remained standing at the head of the table. Mortimer Pell glanced toward the lower pasture through the window. My recommendation is a simple one, Mr. Holloway. Sell the 11 heifers now. The Cheyenne offer is fair given the conditions. The debt shrinks. You're not feeding cattle that may not see April. He folded his hands across the papers. You are an excellent cattleman, Mr. Holloway. A faint, polished smile crossed his face. But Winter, he tapped the papers once more, and arithmetic are very different professions. From the kitchen doorway, Hadley continued kneading bread dough on the floured pine table. Flour still dusted her forearms up to the elbow. She never once looked away from the supper table in the dining room. Every figure spoken aloud found a place in her memory as clearly as if she had written it down herself. Then Mortimer Pell's eyes drifted toward the kitchen for the first time since he had stepped inside. The widow woman, he said casually, without quite meeting her gaze, needn't concern herself with matters of business and credit. The room became perfectly still. A pinch of flour slipped from Hadley's fingertips onto the worn board floor. It was quiet enough in the dining room for every man at the table to hear that small sound land. Mortimer Pell slid the agreement smoothly across the table. Sign it today, he said, his voice as polished as his boots, and you'll still have daylight enough to move the heifers before the next cold front comes down through the pass. Wade looked at the paper. He did not reach for the pen resting beside it. Before either man could speak again, Hadley stepped out of the kitchen. She wiped her hands once on the corner of her apron, then walked the length of the dining room with the same measured pace she used when carrying a heavy kettle. Sila's pen frowned from his place near the wall. Jasper Doone straightened slowly where he stood. Mortimer Pell barely turned his head. "This is a matter of credit, ma'am," he said, "not of cooking." Hadley answered him by placing her small ledger on the table beside his neat stack of papers. The worn leather cover carried flour dust and a faint stain of bean broth instead of ink. She opened it carefully to the middle. No recipes filled the pages, only columns, flour remaining in pounds, beans by the sack and by the pound, salt beef, coffee at storm pace, cornmeal, rendered fat, oats, kitchen scraps saved each week and what they could become, estimated hay consumption per head per day, the projected winter weight of each of the 11 heifers if they continued to gain at the current rate, the number of days Black Pine could remain isolated from Pine Hollow if deep snow closed the wagon road. Mortimer Pell's expression shifted for the first time since he had stepped down from the buggy. Hadley rested one flour-dusted finger on a line of figures. "If the heifers are sold now, the debt becomes smaller," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the long dining room without effort. She moved her finger to another column. "But the breeding herd becomes smaller too." She moved it again. "If these 11 heifers survive the winter, their value next spring will not come from beef. It will come from calves." She turned the page. "The breeding contracts with the 2 ranches west of Pine Hollow alone will return more than this Cheyenne sale ever could. And those contracts have already been spoken of openly at the feed store." No one in the room interrupted her. She was not arguing. She was simply giving an accounting of a season that had not yet happened. Mortimer Pell looked down at her ledger, then back at his own neat papers. For the first time in his long career carrying credit notes across 3 counties, someone had answered finance with figures instead of feelings. Wade Holloway remained silent. Then, without taking his eyes from the open ledger, he reached beside the table and pulled out the empty chair next to his own. He did not ask Hadley to sit. He did not tell her to stay. He simply made room for her at the table. Every man in the room understood what that quiet movement of a chair meant. Mortimer Pell tapped his papers with one careful finger. "My figures are drawn from today's market in Cheyenne, ma'am." "So are mine," Hadley replied evenly. "They are simply measured in different units." She turned another page. "The heifers have eaten steadily for 26 days now. The mash has increased from half a bucket to nearly 2 full buckets per feeding. The 2 weakest no longer leave the trough early. Their winter coats have already begun to fill in along the shoulders and hips." She glanced toward the pantry. "If kitchen waste stays this low, 16 men can eat well for 13 days without any outside supply at all." Storm rations would stretch that figure to 19. Mortimer Pell offered her a thin, polished smile. "Kitchen arithmetic, ma'am." From the far end of the long room, old Wiley Tate finally spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "That, sir," he said quietly, "is the only kind of arithmetic Winter has ever respected." Mortimer Pell lowered his eyes again to the flour-stained ledger, then to Hadley's flour-dusted hands resting calmly beside it. For the first time since he had arrived at Black Pine Ranch, he could no longer pretend the widow woman was not part of the conversation. He drew in one long, careful breath through his nose. Mortimer Pell pushed the agreement across the table one final time. "If the snow closes the road through Pine Hollow Pass," he said evenly, "and those 11 heifers do not see April, the Credit Association will not renegotiate this balance. I want that understood plainly before I leave this house." The room fell silent. Wade Holloway looked at the unsigned paper, then at Hadley's open ledger, then at Jasper Doone and old Wiley Tate. Neither man spoke. Neither one of them needed to. Everything worth saying was already lying open on the long pine table. The ledger did not promise success. It offered something better than a promise. It offered a plan, one built out of meals and feed and weather and honest work instead of out of fear. Wade slowly pushed the agreement back across the table toward Mortimer Pell. "We keep them," he said. He spoke so quietly that no one in the room would have called it a speech. And yet the words settled over the dining room the way a heavy gate settles into its frame when it is finally closed for the night. Mortimer Pell gathered his papers without hurry. As he slipped them into his leather case, he looked at Wade one last time. "Winter will teach you, Mr. Holloway, whether this was wisdom or whether it was stubbornness." Without waiting for an answer, he stepped out into the cold yard and climbed back into his covered buggy. The sound of its polished wheels faded down the frozen road toward Pine Hollow. Inside the house, Hadley closed her small ledger. She carried it back into the kitchen and lifted the iron lid from the kettle on the stove. The broth inside had just begun to simmer. She added another small piece of salt beef, stirred the kettle once with her long wooden spoon, and went on with her work as though nothing unusual had passed through the dining room. Behind her, Silas Penn watched from the doorway. "If those heifers don't see April," he muttered under his breath, "folks across 3 counties will remember this day." Hadley never lifted her head. She was listening to something else. Outside, the north wind had begun to rise again across the open pasture. Mortimer Pell's departure changed nothing about Hadley Crow's routine. If anything, it pushed her to move faster. Winning an argument around a dining table would never carry a ranch through winter. Preparation would. She spent the next several days building what she quietly called, in her own ledger, the Storm Kitchen. The first new shelves filled with hardtack biscuits baked twice until they could survive several weeks in a cool pantry without molding. Beside them sat tallow cakes wrapped tightly in clean cloth, jars of bone broth reduced down on the back of the stove until every spoonful carried more nourishment than its size suggested, and a heavy kettle of strong coffee boiled down into a dark concentrate that could be stretched later with hot water when fuel grew scarce. Nothing was prepared for comfort. Everything was prepared for endurance. Near the pantry door, Hadley hung a small slate board on a leather thong. Each row across it carried only a single word in careful chalk: flour, beans, salt beef, coffee, oats, rendered fat, cornmeal. Every evening, just before she trimmed the lamps, she adjusted the figures beside each word with a fresh piece of chalk. The board did not record what had been cooked that day. It recorded only what still remained in the pantry to be cooked. Outside the kitchen, she asked Jasper Doone to move another stack of hay closer to the lower pen before the first heavy snow buried the wagon trail. Feed sacks were lifted onto wooden runners instead of being left to rest on frozen ground that would steal their dryness 1 inch at a time. Heavy oilcloth and canvas covered every stack along the top, but Hadley insisted the sides be left open so air could still move freely beneath them. "Covered is not enough," she explained when Jasper asked her about it. "If air cannot move, moisture stays, and moisture always wins in the end." Jasper Doone nodded without questioning her further. Even Sela's pen had begun to change in small, silent ways. He never once admitted that she might have been right about anything. He simply began splitting smaller pieces of kindling every evening and stacking them beside the stove exactly the way Hadley preferred them. No one in the kitchen ever mentioned the difference out loud. One bitter night late in December, long after supper had been cleared and the lamps had been turned low, old Brindle suddenly sprang up from his place beside the warm hearth and began barking sharply toward the corral. Not once. Again and again, the way a dog only barks when something he cannot explain has shifted in the dark beyond the lantern light. Hadley was already reaching for her wool coat when Jasper Doone pulled the kitchen door open. The wind struck them both like a flat board. Their lantern light found one of the smallest heifers, the same little red one with the torn ear, tangled hard against a fence rail near the lower gate. She was too weak from the cold to free herself before the temperature dropped any further into the night. Working together without speaking more than a handful of words, Hadley and Jasper cut the twisted hemp rope away from the post, steadied the frightened animal between them, and slowly guided her behind the largest haystack on the lee side of the pen, where the wind could no longer strike her broadside. The little red heifer trembled beneath Hadley's hand. Hadley rested her palm flat against the warm neck for a long moment. The heat was still there. Small, fragile, but alive beneath the dull winter coat. She did not smile. She simply stood, listening to the wind roar over the top of the haystack into the empty pasture beyond. Preparation was never an act of fear on the frontier. It was the simplest form of respect a person could show to winter. The blizzard arrived during the second week of January in the year 1888. It did not ask permission. It did not announce itself. It simply erased the wagon road between Black Pine Ranch and Pine Hollow as though that road had never existed in the first place. For 5 straight days, snow buried every track leading in or out of Pine Hollow Basin. Then the wind grew stronger still. White snow lifted from the frozen ground until sky and earth became one single color with no horizon between them. No one at the ranch could see more than 15 feet ahead of his own hand. The iron pump in the yard froze solid the morning of the second day. The chimney smoke hugged the cedar shingles of the kitchen roof before disappearing into the storm. Every trip to the haystack felt like walking face first into a wall of knives. No man wasted a single movement outside. No man wasted a single piece of fuel inside. Inside the main house, Hadley followed the storm schedule she had built quietly into her ledger weeks earlier. Hardtack biscuits replaced fresh bread at every meal. Bone broth warmed stiff hands before the first gray light reached the windows. Coffee concentrate stretched every handful of roasted beans into 3 days instead of 1. Nothing was guessed. Everything had already been counted long before the wind arrived. The stove never smoked back into the room. The flue was warmed first with a folded newspaper taper every morning. The smaller kindling caught quickly. The draft held clean through every hour of the storm. The pantry stayed dry because every sack stood 7 inches above the floor instead of leaning against it. Outside, the 11 heifers crowded behind the leeward haystack, eating warm bran mash from their wooden trough before turning to their hay. Even the weakest of them stayed on her feet through every long night. On the morning of the 7th day, a figure staggered into the yard through the blowing snow. It was one of Ezra Goff's youngest ranch hands. His beard and eyebrows were white with ice. His lips were cracked open in 3 places. "I need broth," he said, struggling to catch his breath against the burning cold in his lungs. "2 of our men are down with fever and they cannot keep solid food on their stomachs." He hesitated, his eyes lowering for one brief moment. "And how do you make that warm mash, ma'am? Half our cattle have stopped eating their hay altogether." Hadley filled a heavy iron kettle with bone broth without saying a single word. Then, instead of explaining the mash with words, she took a clean wooden bucket from the row beside the back door and mixed a full batch right there in front of him so that he could see with his own eyes exactly how it was done. Bran, sour milk, warm water from the stove kettle, a small pinch of salt. Bread ends crumbled fine between her fingers. Across the kitchen, Sela's pen quietly laid another armful of wrist-sized kindling beside the stove. He never looked at Hadley while he did it. He simply made certain there would be enough wood prepared and split for the next fire of the morning. For Sela's pen, after 15 winters at Black Pine Ranch, that was the only apology a man like him knew how to make. Outside, the storm continued to rage across the open country. Inside the warm kitchen, every careful lesson Hadley Crowe had written into the pages of her small ledger had survived its first true test. 2 days later, the wind finally eased. Not enough that anyone in Pine Hollow Basin would have called it calm, only enough to let a man on horseback reach another ranch without disappearing into blowing white. Ezra Goff rode in alone. His face was burned raw red by the cold. Dark circles hung beneath both eyes. He looked 10 years older than he had the afternoon he had laughed down at Hadley from his saddle. He removed his heavy hat at the kitchen door. There was no laughter in him this time at all. "We've still got beef in the smokehouse," he said quietly, "but the sick men cannot keep it down. Our broth ran out 3 days ago. The weakest of our cattle won't touch dry hay." He hesitated, then forced himself to finish. "And half our flour barrel spoiled clean through." It had been sitting against the cold cellar wall since October. No one in the kitchen spoke. Ezra Goff looked toward Hadley. "How do you make that bean mash, ma'am? And how do you keep flour dry through a season like this one?" She did not remind him of the jokes he had told from his saddle. She did not mention the day he had laughed at her ledger in front of his own ranch hands. Instead, she tore a clean square from a brown paper sack and wrote down only what mattered most. Bran. Sour milk, warm water, a pinch of salt, feed small portions, feed often, never once a day. Then she added one final line below the rest. Raise every flour sack 7 inches off the cellar floor. Leave open air beneath every sack. She folded the brown paper once, then twice, and handed it across the floured table to him. Ezra Goff accepted it with both hands, not carelessly, carefully. The way a man accepts something that carries more honest value than any of the silver still resting in his coat pocket. Across the kitchen, old Wiley Tate watched the exchange without saying a single word. He had seen this happen before, in other winters, in other counties. The frontier had a quiet way of settling arguments that men never quite could on their own. Ezra Goff slipped the folded paper carefully inside the breast of his coat. He never once said the words, "I was wrong," out loud. Everyone in the warm kitchen understood that the way he had held that small piece of brown paper sack was apology enough. A week after the storm finally broke, the wagon road began to appear once more beneath the drifting snow. That was all the invitation Mortimer Pell needed. He returned in his polished buggy, expecting to find a desperate ranch ready at last to sign his agreement. Instead, the first thing he noticed was the lower pen. The 11 heifers were still there. They were not heavy yet. They were not ready for any spring market, but every one of them stood squarely on her feet. Their winter coats carried a healthy shine instead of the rough, dull look they had worn back in October. Every head lowered toward the feed trough without hesitation when Hadley walked down to them with her bucket. Mortimer Pell said nothing at all. Inside the main house, Wade Holloway placed 2 ledgers side by side on the dining table. One belonged to the Credit Association. The other belonged to Hadley Crowe, widow of Black Pine Ranch.